Picture this. The sun is sinking over the banks of the Nile, its golden light spilling across towering temples and colossal statues that seem to defy time itself. You are walking through the heart of ancient Thebes in the final years of the 18th dynasty, a city where priests whisper sacred hymns, where merchants barter in crowded markets, and where the very air hums with the weight of gods and kings. But behind the shimmering facade of this eternal civilization, you stumble upon whispers so unsettling that they make your stomach twist. Whispers about the most powerful man in the world, a pharaoh whose quest for immortality has driven him beyond the boundaries of morality, beyond the boundaries of family, and perhaps beyond the boundaries of sanity itself. His name was Akhenaten, the heretic king, a ruler who defied centuries of tradition, who abandoned the gods of his ancestors, and who dreamed of remaking Egypt in his own image. But what history often glosses over, what remains hidden between the lines of dusty papyrus and fractured stone inscriptions, is the tale of how that dream curdled into obsession, an obsession so intense that he turned to his own flesh and blood in a desperate attempt to cheat death. Imagine it, a man hailed as the living son of the sun god Ra, clothed in divine authority, gazing upon his own daughter not as a child to be protected but as a vessel to carry his broken fantasies of eternity. To the outside world, the pharaoh was a god, but within the palace walls, his grief, his paranoia, and his lust for control birthed one of the most disturbing episodes in the chronicles of kingship. This is not the Egypt of pyramids and grandeur taught in classrooms. This is a darker Egypt, where devotion and perversion blur, where love and power twist into something unrecognizable, and where the quest for immortality turns father into husband, child into wife, and the royal household into a stage for the grotesque theater of human obsession. Before we peel back the layers of this forbidden history, take a moment to realize that these stories are not simply ancient curiosities. They are reminders that absolute power, unchecked and unchallenged, has always had the ability to deform love into tyranny, reverence into fear, and family into tragedy. And what you are about to hear will linger with you long after the sands of Egypt have swallowed the echoes of its temples. Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn into the darker corners of history, the stories that shock, disturb, and linger long after they are told, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the only way to ensure you do not miss the next descent into the shadows of the past. Now, with that warning given, let us begin. To understand how such a nightmare could unfold, we need to step inside the mind of Akhenaten himself, a man who began his reign with the promise of divine favor, but whose vision soon spiraled into isolation and obsession. When he first rose to the throne of Egypt, many believed they were entering a golden age. He was young, energetic, and filled with conviction that he alone had been chosen by the sun god Aten to reshape the world. Instead of worshiping the familiar pantheon of Egyptian gods Osiris, Isis, Horus, and the countless other deities who had guided the land for millennia, Akhenaten demanded that the empire bow to a single force, the blazing disk of the sun. He closed temples, stripped priests of their power, and ordered that names of the old gods be chiseled away from monuments, erased as though they had never existed. At first, some may have admired his daring. To challenge centuries of tradition required audacity, even brilliance. But audacity quickly hardened into delusion. As the years passed, Akhenaten began to see not only himself as the prophet of Aten, but as Aten's living embodiment. His face, elongated and alien in the art he commissioned, appeared everywhere, carved into temples, painted onto walls, stamped onto official seals. He moved the capital itself from Thebes to a brand new city, Akhetaten, a place built to glorify his god and his rule, a monument to his ego that devoured the resources of the kingdom. To his followers, he was a visionary. To his enemies, he was a heretic. But to those trapped within his palace walls, his wives, his children, his attendants, he was something far more terrifying. A man who could not be contradicted, whose word reshaped reality, whose grief and desires were law. Ancient inscriptions praise him as radiant and eternal. But behind the stone mask was a mortal man, consumed by fear of death. And it was that fear, gnawing at him day and night, that began to twist his love for his family into something unspeakable. For what could a god-king do when even divine authority could not protect him from the one fate that claimed all men? Akhenaten believed he had found the answer, and it lay disturbingly close to home. Within the gilded chambers of Akhetaten, behind curtains embroidered with the rays of the sun disk. The pharaoh's daughters grew up under the gaze of a man who no longer seemed to distinguish between divine visions and his own desires. Among them was his beloved child, Akhenaten, a girl celebrated in carvings as graceful and radiant, often shown at her father's side receiving the golden light of Aten. To the artisans who sculpted those images, she was a princess embodying purity and dynastic promise. But to Akhenaten, increasingly unmoored from reality, she became something more dangerous, a vessel through which he could defy mortality itself. When his chief queen, Nefertiti, seemed to fade from prominence, some say through disgrace, others whisper through death, Akhenaten turned his eyes upon Akhenaten with a fixation that no father should ever allow himself. He began to draw her into rituals meant for a consort, not a child. In temple reliefs, her figure appears elevated, her position almost replacing that of Nefertiti, a subtle yet chilling suggestion that the pharaoh's public devotion was shifting inward, toward blood of his own blood. The courtiers and priests, stripped of power and terrified of contradiction, said nothing. After all, who could question a man who declared himself the living sun? But silence is its own form of complicity, and in that silence, Akhenaten's obsession festered. He was convinced that through sacred union with his daughter, he could channel Aten's life-giving force directly, binding himself more tightly to the eternal flame, weaving his mortal body into the cycle of cosmic rebirth. It was blasphemy, disguised as worship, perversion, dressed as piety. Imagine the girl herself, barely a woman, forced into a role where her childhood was erased, her body transformed into a tool for her father's desperation. In the cool stone halls where music echoed and incense burned, Akhenaten was paraded not as a daughter cherished but as a consort enthroned, the unwilling key to a twisted promise of immortality. The boundaries of family, of sanctity, of decency all were shattered under the crushing weight of a ruler who believed himself untouchable. And though the records of scribes and the whispers of archaeologists cloak the details in ambiguity, the fragments that remain hint at a reality as grotesque as it was tragic. The Pharaoh of Egypt, dispirited to conquer death, consumed the innocence of his own child in the name of eternity. The rituals that followed were cloaked in incense and song, but beneath the sacred trappings they were little more than theater for a single man's delusion. In the great halls of Akhenaten, where towering pillars cast shadows that seemed to stretch forever, Akhenaten staged ceremonies in which Akhenaten stood beside him not as a child of his blood, but as a queen enthroned. Priests, stripped of their old gods and reduced to servants of Aten, carried offerings of bread, wine, and slaughtered oxen, laying them at the feet of a father and daughter now bound in an unholy masquerade. Songs were sung of renewal, of the eternal light of the sun, while the pharaoh touched his daughter's hand with the gravity of a husband, not a parent. To his followers, it was devotion. To those who dared look closer, it was desecration. Akhenaten spoke often of eternal life, of shedding the prison of mortality by becoming one with Aten. But his answer to death was not to prepare his soul with humility, nor to accept the cycles that even kings could not evade. His answer was to blur every boundary, the boundary between God and man, between father and child, between love and possession. He believed that by drawing his daughter into his sacred bed, the divine rays of Aten would fuse their flesh into a single vessel, a human sun that would never be extinguished. For Akhenaten, there was no choice, no voice, no escape. She was paraded before the court in silks and jewels, her name etched into stelae as queenly consort, yet her eyes, if one could imagine them behind the stone and paint, must have betrayed the silent terror of a girl chained to her father's madness. And all the while, the kingdom beyond the palace walls was beginning to crack. Crops failed, soldiers grew restless, vassals in faraway lands whispered rebellion. The gods of old had been silenced, and Aten's promise of eternal radiance seemed to bring only famine and despair. Yet within the palace, Akhenaten clung ever more fiercely to his private cult, convinced that every touch, every union, every desecrated ritual was another step toward triumph over death. It was not triumph. It was tragedy, written in the language of power. A tragedy that left scars not only on one girl's life, but on an entire empire trembling on the edge of collapse. But the human body, no matter how much it is adorned in gold or wrapped in divine titles, cannot be deceived forever. As the years dragged on, Akhenaten's frame began to wither. Ancient depictions show him with elongated limbs, a distended belly, and hollow cheeks, features some believe were symbolic. Others whisper were the marks of disease. Whatever the truth, the God King looked less like a radiant sun and more like a dying flame. Yet the weaker he grew, the more frantic his devotion became. He doubled down on his twisted rites, clinging to Akhenaten as though her presence could anchor him to eternity. At banquets, he demanded she sit at his side as consort, not as daughter, while musicians, strummed harps and dancers spun beneath the painted rays of Aten. Guests applauded with forced smiles, terrified to betray even the faintest flicker of doubt. In private, his paranoia deepened. He feared whispers of dissent. He feared priests who still prayed in secret to the old gods. He feared generals who longed for the stability of earlier dynasties. But above all, he feared the shadow that stalks every mortal, death itself. His solution was not strategy nor legacy, but obsession. He surrounded himself with protective amulets, commissioned hymns that glorified his union with Aten, and continued to bind his daughter more tightly into his delusion. To the outside world, Egypt trembled. Letters from foreign rulers pleaded for aid against invaders, but Akhenaten ignored them. While borders crumbled and vassal states slipped away, his gaze remained fixed on his private ceremonies. Crops withered, trade faltered, soldiers deserted, but within the palace walls, he burned incense, sang hymns, and pressed the weight of his desperation onto the shoulders of a daughter who could neither resist nor flee. The empire was rotting, but Akhenaten did not see an empire. He saw only his fear reflected in the eyes of the girl beside him, and he believed that if he could hold her close enough, long enough, perhaps even the hand of death would hesitate. By the time Akhenaten entered his final years, the contrast between his vision and reality had become unbearable. The city of Akhenaten, once hailed as the radiant horizon of the sun, stood half-finished, its walls cracked, its avenues eerily empty. Beyond its borders, foreign lands that had once bent the knee to Egypt now laughed at its weakness. Armies marched unchecked across lost provinces, and the cries of starving peasants rose like smoke into a sky that seemed to shine ever more mercilessly. Yet within the palace, Akhenaten continued his grotesque theater, clinging to Akhenaten as if she alone could silence the truth gnawing at his bones. He was no eternal god. He was a man diseased, paranoid, and desperate. His skin grew sallow, his frame fragile, his eyes sunken with sleepless nights spent raving of Aten's eternal light. And through it all, Akhenaten was forced to remain at his side, trapped in the gilded cage of her father's crumbling dream. Some inscriptions even hint that she bore him children, though whether those were real or symbolic, history refuses to say. But the suggestion alone is enough to chill the blood. Imagine the loneliness of that girl, adorned as a queen, worshipped in public hymns, yet privately stripped of every shred of innocence. She had become the pharaoh's last gamble against death, his human talisman, his unwilling bridge to eternity. But eternity never came. Instead, the God King's body betrayed him. His speeches grew slurred, his steps faltered, and whispers of madness filled the halls. Priests longed for the return of the old gods. Generals muttered of revolt, and servants whispered behind trembling hands. Yet none dared move against him while he still clung to breath, for he was Pharaoh, even in ruin. As he weakened, his obsession grew more frantic. He clutched Akhenaten's hand with skeletal fingers, begging Aten for another dawn, another day, another hour. But not even the blazing sun he worshipped could stop the shadow creeping closer. And in those suffocating final months, as Egypt crumbled beyond saving, the daughter of the heretic king carried a burden that history can barely speak aloud: the shame, the horror, and the silence of a childhood devoured by a father's fear of death. At last, the inevitable came. The body that Akhenaten had clothed in divinity and drenched in incense collapsed under the weight of time. And the pharaoh who had declared himself the living sun was swallowed by the darkness he had spent his life fleeing. Accounts of his death are scarce, deliberately so, for his successors worked swiftly to erase him. But fragments suggest that his passing was not marked by triumph or serenity, but by paranoia, confusion, and a court suffocating in silence. Akhenaten, still barely more than a girl, may have been by his side in those final moments, forced to play the role of grieving consort as attendants whispered prayers neither to Aten nor to her father, but silently to the gods of old, begging for the nightmare to end. When his last breath left him, Egypt did not rejoice. Egypt seethed. The priests, long humiliated, called for vengeance. Generals, tired of neglect and starvation, demanded restoration. And the people, starved and abandoned, turned their prayers back to the gods who had sustained their ancestors for centuries. Akhenaten's dream of eternal radiance dissolved within days of his death. His name was struck from records, his monuments defaced, his capital abandoned to the desert winds. Where once his face had been carved into stone, hammers shattered it. Where once hymns had praised him as a living god, scribes blotted him out. He was not remembered as a visionary, nor even as a failed king. He was remembered as a heretic, a man whose arrogance nearly unraveled the empire. And yet, for all their efforts to bury him, whispers endured. Whispers of the girl he had crowned as his queen, the daughter whose life had been consumed in his desperate bid to cheat death. Meritaten's fate, after her father's passing, is veiled in uncertainty. Some believe she was forced into marriage with her own brother to preserve a dynasty stained by incest. Others say she vanished, erased as carefully as Akhenaten himself, swallowed by silence. In either case, the truth was too grotesque to carve into stone. Better, the priests decided, to erase the memory altogether, to let the desert sands cover not only the failed Sun King, but the suffering he inflicted on his own blood. And so the sands of Egypt swallowed the city of Akhenaten, burying its palaces, its temples, and its shame. For centuries, Akhenaten's name was cursed, his likeness smashed, his memory condemned to oblivion. Yet silence does not erase truth. Beneath the ruins, archaeologists centuries later unearthed fragments of his rain-broken statues, shattered inscriptions, hints of ceremonies that should never have been. And hidden within those fragments is the shadow of a story too grotesque to be carved openly in stone. A father who crowned his daughter as queen, not to honor her, but to chain her to his fear of death. This is the darkest irony of Akhenaten's dream. He wanted eternity. He wanted to live forever in the glow of the sun he worshipped. But instead, his legacy became a lesson in how power corrupts, how fear distorts, and how the desperate search for immortality can devour everything, even the innocent blood of one's own family. The people of his time tried to erase him, and for a while they succeeded. His city became dust, his name forgotten, his monuments torn down. Yet history has a cruel way of remembering what is meant to be forgotten. Today, we do not recall Akhenaten as the radiant living sun he claimed to be. We recall him as the heretic king, the man who broke gods and boundaries alike, who sacrificed an empire and defiled his own daughter in pursuit of a dream that never came. And in this, there lies the true horror. Not that he failed to escape death, but that he succeeded in ensuring his own story, his grotesque obsession, his perverse faith, his ruin, would live forever. Every empire rises with dreams of eternity, but eternity has its own rules, and it remembers not glory, but the scars of human fear. Perhaps that is the cruelest immortality of all. I hope you all enjoyed the story. Subscribe to our channel for more upcoming stories like this, which your school will never tell you.